a group of London-based peers working in the areas of scholarly communication, research data management, librarianship, publishing, and indeed institutional repositories too. We decided to collaborate across institutional boundaries to collectivize our efforts and to try and create something new to coincide with Open Access Week. We really wanted to try and respond to some of the frustrations that some of us might have experienced with what we might consider perhaps the poison chalice that might have become of openness. As such, we've worked together to try and forge a broader type of event for practitioners and research communities, and we very much hope that you'll be able to participate and interact as you see fit throughout the week and beyond. More of that on Friday, so if you want to sign up for Friday sessions, if you've not already, please feel free to do so. A little bit of marketing for you there. Onto some of the formal bits for today, which I'll try and keep as brief as is necessary. As with all sessions at London Open Research Week, the session is being recorded, and that includes the questions and answer session. So any questions that you ask may well indeed be recorded. If you do not consent to being recorded, please do feel free to use the comment function, and we'll ensure that any questions are asked pseudonymously on your behalf. Secondly, I'd like to remind all participants of our code of conduct, as is stated on the website. It is and will continue to be applied throughout this session and indeed throughout every session of the week. And thinking a little bit about accessibility, if you'd like to enable live captions on the Teams desktop app, you can do so by clicking on the More Options button, which is the one with the three little dots on, and then there's the option to turn on live captions. So I think that's most of the administration done with for this part of the session. And as such, it's with great pleasure that I can introduce Samuel A. Moore as our keynote speaker. Sam has been generous enough to kick off London Open Research Week for us. And as I'm sure many of you are well aware, Sam is a scholarly communication specialist and researcher at Cambridge University Library. With an interest in academic publishing and research assessment, his work sits at the intersections of education, media and information studies. He has a PhD in digital humanities from King's College London and over a decade's experience as a publisher and a researcher. He's also one of the organisers of the Radical Open Access Collective. Following Sam's talk, there will be a question and answer session where we can further explore some of the topics and themes that Sam will be discussing in today's session on what's the point of radical open access. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to raise them in the Q&A session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sam for the inaugural keynote of London Open Research Week.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Let me just get the slides. Okay, can you see and hear me? Or see the slides?
Absolutely. Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to talk today. The title of this is what's the point of radical open access? I guess first off, I just want to thank the organisers of the event. So thanks, Kevin and Carly, David, Emin, and Stephen. Sorry if I've missed anyone there. It's great to see this kind of collaborative approach to Open Access Week that often involves lots of silos. So it's really cool to see that. And also great to see one that is turning a kind of a critical eye to open access and openness and those kinds of ideas. So my career to date has been preoccupied by a sort of a love-hate relationship with open access. I think that open and free cultures are kind of good for a variety of reasons, as we'll explore. But I'm also concerned with how open access has been rolled out in practice, which is kind of the theme of this whole week. But I've been involved in OA for the past 15 or so years, initially as a publisher at PLOS and Ubiquity Press, later as an academic studying grassroots and policy-based approaches to OA, and also trying to, as Kevin mentioned, trying to nurture kind of alternative approaches to OA through the Radical Open Access Collective, which I'll discuss today. And I now work at Cambridge University Library as a scholarly communication specialist, and I'm advising on the university's kind of strategy around open access publishing. So I'm going to try and explore some of these tensions associated with the move to OA through an exploration of the point of open access from the perspective of kind of left or emancipatory or radical politics. So So I should note that I'm not trying to convince any of you to adopt a particular political standpoint. Instead, what I'm doing is aiming my talks at those of us who kind of already share this broad political horizon of a future away from capitalism and neoliberalism and the sort of the marketization of everything connected to higher education. I'm intentionally keeping this definition quite vague for reasons that should be clear as I proceed, but maybe not. But ultimately, I'm going to explore here what I feel is the point of open access as a political project. So I'll probably speak for about 25, 30 minutes, and then hopefully I'll pose a few questions at the end, and I'd like to be able to kind of try to think through some of these issues together if possible. So this is the first slide. So dominant forms of open access were never intended to be radical. So for any understanding of the politics of open access, we need to kind of keep this in mind, I think. And I think it's worth beginning with the Budapest Open Access Initiative, which is kind of hailed by many as the defining event in the history of open access. The BOAI was the work of 16 different authors, and it was signed in February 2002, so it's 20 years old next year. Its politics are kind of liberal, and they rely in part on sort of faith in the market and consensus building with a broad church of stakeholders to harness what were then kind of new digital technologies to share information for everyone. So this is the sort of the flavor. This is the opening paragraph of the BOAI, just to get a sense for the kind of language of it. They say an old tradition and new technology have converged to make possible an unprecedented public good. The old tradition is the willingness of scientists and scholars to publish the fruits of their research in scholarly journals without payment for the sake of inquiry and knowledge. The new technology is the internet. The public good they make possible is the worldwide electronic distribution of the peer-reviewed journal literature, completely free and unrestricted access to it by all scientists and scholars, teachers, students, and other curious minds. So the BOAI exists within a particular time where tech solutionism was like the thing, absolutely ubiquitous. I mean, it still is, but this was like kind of, it was assumed that the internet would solve all of our issues. It talks kind of optimistically about sharing the rich with the poor and the poor with the rich, and then promotes a sort of business-friendly approach to free culture, like those of Creative Commons that treat resources as individual property rather than kind of communally owned. It's worth keeping in mind, though, that the BOAI brought a variety of disparate perspectives together. It's really easy to criticize the BOAI, but it was never its point to be kind of radical. So what was to come out of it could never have been more than a commitment to free access to research under very broad conditions. And I put this image here on the right of the Unsettling Knowledge Inequities podcast, because I think last week or maybe the week before, they released a podcast where they discussed the BOAI with 4 different signatories of it and how it came together. And it's just really interesting, and it shows the sort of the richness and the diversity of the opinions and the perspectives that went into it. And so what happened was it could only ever have been funneled through this sort of this kind of very broad approach to free access to research. So we don't want to hold it too high in esteem or kind of assume that it could have done too much is my kind of point. But nonetheless, so while I don't want to attribute too much causality to the BOAI, because it is just one statement, it is important to note that, sorry, the car going past. It's important to note that the dominant forms of open access that came after it are not antagonistic to capital or the markets. And many of them reinforce this kind of marketization or champion a cheaper form of publishing that devalues expert labor behind publishing. And this is perhaps because of open access's history with the open source movement and the idea that publishing could simply be a button in the digital age, or everything could be done technically rather than through sort of human work. And I explore some of these issues in an article on the genealogy of open access if you want some further reading, I guess. But suffice to say, open access is not necessarily a politically progressive pursuit. And in many ways, it simply reinforces the dominance of the market. So we have this slide here. I mean, it's not really helpful for giving us anything other than the sense of lots of money in the system being paid for APCs. But these are sort of APCs reported, and then we see sort of 5 publishers receive a huge amount of money, and there's a long tail of others, but essentially we're talking about kind of a lot of money here. Or you could also think about the recent report from consultants Delta Think, who estimate that the open access market has now grown to just shy of $1 billion. So we're talking big sums of money now for open access. It's moving towards being the primary way of distribution of research. And for many publishers, then the point of open access publishing is profit. And also for many not-for-profit publishers, they still operate according to kind of commercial extractivist principles. And so for those hoping it would ease library budgets, open access does not really appear to help here either. We have transformative agreements. Sorry, just getting my slides up. Transformative agreements, they kind of merely transform the money spent from subscribing to subscribing and publishing with the same commercial publishers, while also offering commercial publishers the opportunity to sort of increase publication volume through agreements with universities that they never really had an agreement with. So it encourages them to go out to a different sort of collection of universities, I guess. Dave Gamandi has written very eloquently on this and very persuasively, so I encourage you to go out and read his piece on transformative agreements, because it's very good and it's very excoriating. And then we have kind of funder solutions like the Open Research Europe, which is a platform designed by Taylor and Francis that's specifically for researchers funded by Horizon Europe. They're also representative of this kind of commercial tender process where companies have to compete as service providers. But of course, only the big service providers are the ones that can actually get the contract to do this kind of thing. So again, it just rehearses the sort of the marketization of publishing. And then finally, Diamond Open Access, which is really cool, and I really kind of like the idea that people shouldn't have to pay to publish to read or publish in a journal. But we still see that it was never defined specifically away from for-profit publishing, for instance. And so Elsevier at the bottom here has even hosted an event kind of touting its reputation as a Diamond Open Access publisher. And so it's important to note, I think, that the advocates for open access continue to argue for this kind of market competition. A recent paper on replacing academic journals by Bjorn Brems and colleagues argues for replacing, quote, the monopolies connected to the journals with a genuine, functioning and well-regulated market. In this new market, substitutable service providers compete and innovate according to the conditions of the scholarly community, avoiding another vendor lock-in. So in this instance, the authors have faith in the idea that a market will best produce the kinds of outcomes they desire. The problem, of course, with this line of thinking is that it looks to market competition to solve a problem created by market competition, missing the fact that so many of the problems with scholarly publishing arise simply from the fact that it has been ceded entirely to a commercial industry outside of researcher control. And so kind of to address the theme with Open Access Week, saying it directly, building structural equity is not possible under the structures of capitalism. So the point I want to make is that big and all-encompassing transitions from one system of publishing to another are reflecting the neoliberal politics of the day. This is because the bigger the project, the more it has to bring the dominant politics along with it. So as much as the theme of this year's OA Week is about building structural equity, and as much as this is exactly what we should be striving for, it's still true that the transition to open access is going to follow a playbook that foregrounds the dominant cultures of neoliberalism, which is to say the idea of white, rational Western man whose worth is measured with respect to market outcomes. There's no structural equity to be had within this ideology. It's a project that kind of shapes everything that it governs. But it's so important, and it's clearly also not the point of open access to solve this problem. It was never framed that way, so we shouldn't be looking at it to solve this. You can't criticize it for that. So for advocates of a left-leaning approach to open access publishing, there's this bind at work whereby dominant forms of OA merely rehearse cultures of neoliberalism, but also that open access would never have gained the popularity it has if it were originally framed as a radical project that wanted to eradicate the commercial imperative from publishing. So it would never have been taken up by conservative policymakers in the UK, private philanthropic funders the world over, or championed by universities as the way forward, or adopted by commercial publishers as the focus of their business models. Like capital just swallows it all. So the ushering in of open access is a mixed blessing for exactly these reasons. There is money floating around for open access, as long as it conforms with the cultures of the agencies that are providing this money. So the university offers us space for us to gather and to think about these issues, but it still ultimately shapes the material conditions according to which we will operate. And so this is what allows commercial publishing to persist in the way it does. Pretty much no one likes Elsevier, but everyone is still beholden to it. And I know that from speaking to researchers at Cambridge. I cannot get anyone to say a good word about the publisher Elsevier, but 25% of Cambridge's research is published through them. So there's this continual sort of bind, the difference between the ideological and the material kind of sides of things. So what then is the point of radical forms of open access? I don't want this talk to be too pessimistic, because I am genuinely kind of a fan of open access as a kind of both a political project and the chance to reach kind of broad audiences with freely accessible academic literature. I just think that advocates need to sort of temper their expectations around what OA can hope to achieve. And so if big systemic transitions naturally lead to regressive outcomes, as I've argued that they do so far, then the counterpoint to this is to nurture small experiments in radical and alternative forms of open access. So I'm just going to talk now about kind of how many of us are sort of trying to do just this. So radical forms of open access seek to remove the influence of the market on publishing. And they point to a world in which publication is adequately supported or subsidized and made accessible to all without recourse to the commercial imperative or market returns. This is the primary reason I'm interested in open access. It offers the opportunity to explore ways of moving publishing away from the market and returning control to academic communities for a variety of emancipatory and scholarly ends. And we've tried to do this, particularly in the Radical Open Access Collective, which is what I'll talk about now. So the Radical Open Access Collective is an organization founded in 2015 as a way of exploring different forms of relationality and organization for scholar-led DIY small press publishing, particularly open access publishing. We're a member organization, a global organization of 70 academic-led presses, kind of and growing. Somewhat dormant at the moment, but it's kind of bursts of activity and then it goes down again. And what we do is we share resources and advice on not-for-profit academic publishing and open access and how to kind of go about these kinds of things. But then alongside looking after one another, we try to sort of act as a distinctive voice that builds this kind of mutual reliance for alternative forms of open access. So we want to bring other people in and support them too. So these are some of the members of the collective. They're kind of often humanities, small publishers. Many of them don't publish that much. It's all very kind of it can be happenstance. It can be quite. Also, there are very professional publishers as well associated with it. Monograph publishers, journal publishers. It kind of runs the gamut really. And if anyone has a publishing project they want to join, then get in touch with us. And so, in moving away from these marketized forms of publishing, the Radical Open Access Collective seeks to foreground different cultures of knowledge production than those associated with commercial publishing. For example, we hope to support new and underrepresented cultures of knowledge, particularly those from outside the Anglophone world, but also to learn from our members from places such as Latin America, where non-commercial OA is standard and is far superior to the approaches in the global north. And acting outside of commerciality also allows these presses to publish work without the need for a commercial return, allowing experimentation in terms of subject matter, form, and style. Members rarely have conventional business models or ways of recouping costs, and they rely instead on in-kind support done as a kind of labour of love, described by Pia and colleagues in their 2020 piece on the Commonplace platform, which is a really good read. And this means that the presses are highly precarious and are encouraged then to rely on one another for mutual support. Radical forms of OA also distinguish themselves from sort of more cookie cutter production processes. of commercial publishers by promoting an ethic of care that attends to the relational practice of publishing, and highlighting and caring for the finished publication and the relationships involved throughout the publishing process, from authors and editors and reviewers to typesetters, copy editors, indexers, and beyond, across the whole sort of editorial and production process. And this involves, kind of amongst other things, paying and rewarding and acknowledging people fairly for their labour where possible, while also ensuring the efforts of volunteers are not exploited or overly relied upon. We're especially interested in asking people to divert their labour from commercial publishers because we give them a lot of free labour to more kind of radical or kind of interesting and exciting approaches, such as those of the Radical Open Access Collective. So initiatives like the Radical Open Access Collective seek to take advantage of the popularity and the timeliness of open access for more progressive ends. So as funding and support is available for sort of small scale publishing projects, the collective arguably approaches publishing in the terms Stefano Hani and Fred Moten describe in The Undercommons, where they write, "It cannot be denied that the university is a place of refuge, and it cannot be accepted that the university is a place of enlightenment. In the face of these conditions, one can only sneak into the university and steal what one can." So the university is, for Moten and Hani, it's a gathering of resources and individuals that can be put towards radical ends. But the neoliberal university is still for them a site of brutal exploitation and expropriation. In a similar vein, open access is currently supported in a number of regressive places that afford the potential to sort of sneak into it and to steal what we can. So the Radical Open Access Collective therefore represents a kind of undercommons of its own, a place where researchers can share work outside of the structures of the contemporary marketized publishing industry as part of a community of sort of alternative knowledge workers. But the question I guess I want to ask now is, could it be more than this? Can radical forms of open access kind of chip away at the dominance of the commercial imperative? And the answer is probably not, but there are ways that we can try thinking about this through ideas of scalability. And so I'd like to end with a discussion then of a possible future for small scale publishing initiatives that might be able to undermine some of the dominant forms of open access that I just discussed in the first section. So in her book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, Anna Lowenhaupt-Singh discusses how projects that are not designed to expand, like those in the Radical Open Access Collective, are necessarily more diverse than those intended to scale up, like platforms and commercial organizations. She writes that the main distinguishing feature between scalable and non-scalable projects is not ethical conduct, but rather that the latter are more diverse because they're not geared up for expansion. This is because economies of scale are standardized, so they do not change as they grow, leading to this kind of cookie cutter style of for-profit publishing that we're so familiar with, is that the production process doesn't change between 10 and 10,000 articles. This is kind of stretched thing. But what do you do then if you're interested in a diverse ecology of open access publishing, as I am, but you would like it to be able to grow or be sustained in the future without being homogenized by market forces? So my colleague Janneke Adema and I have described an organizational approach to resilient and mutual reliant forms of open access that can be more than the sum of its parts. And we're calling this scaling small. And so we published an article on this at the start of this year in Westminster Papers on Communications, where we write that the relationalities of publishing we are arguing for here focus on achieving scale across multiple organizations with a focus on care and collectivity and cooperation rather than competition. So it's about bringing lots of like-minded organizations together to get them to cooperate and to care for one another. This is done through horizontal collaborations, which is to say collaborations between like-minded and organizations of a similar kind of style. So in this instance, small local scholar-led open access presses, but also through vertical collaborations with other kinds of entities with similar goals, which could be, from our perspective, like library publishing, new university presses, or learned societies, as long as they share this kind of broad horizon away from commerciality. But it also kind of requires us to sort of collaborate and support communities that open access should be serving kind of to begin with, which are things like patient groups, mutual aid groups, free and alternative universities, radical libraries, those kinds of things too. And then thought about this different. If you think about it from this way, you think open access publishing requires a different kind of infrastructural solution, I guess. And so things like the COPEN project, which is supporting open access book publishing, and then the Open Library of Humanities, they're the kinds of infrastructures that support this kind of small publishing. They provide funding and they provide open source software and other kind of forms of support for small publishers to do that. And they are specifically looking for people to work with, I guess. And so they're really important. It's a way of thinking about infrastructure, kind of in opposition to the standard big platforms of publishers. And so scaling small calls for these different shared infrastructures to the big platforms and databases of commercial organizations, but crucially also to the small startup presses that launch with the sole hopes of getting acquired and scaling up and then being acquired by Elsevier or Wiley or Taylor and Francis. From the perspective of these projects, open access is about infinite growth of submissions and publications, and it's done indiscriminately and carelessly. And scaling small in opposition, it prizes and preserves smallness and diversity and cooperation. And so it therefore offers a counterpoint to these kinds of large-scale oligopolistic projects by reintroducing the importance of locality and smallness into publishing. Publishing is a necessarily situated and local activity. It's a community-driven thing. And so the point of open access publishing then is to try to encourage this smallness and local diversity where possible, and then to work against big transition rhetoric that just further leads to the dominance of the market. So I'm going to stop there, but I have a few questions, because I want, if anyone wants to try and think through this together, I'd be really kind of interested. But firstly, I mean, is this too pessimistic, what I've come up with? Does open access hold kind of greater potential as a political project than I'm giving it credit for? Am I in fact too optimistic? Can initiatives like library publishing and the Radical Open Access Collective ever hope to form any kind of counter to traditional forms of publishing? And does the university itself have to actually be upended for open access to truly flourish? Or can we kind of sneak into it and steal what we can, as I suggest? So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sam. That's, as ever, incredibly eye-opening and incisive, and I've certainly got a million questions, and I'd love to talk about some of this, as I'm sure I hopefully will, but I don't want to dominate the floor. So to all of the attendees, you should now be able to unmute yourself. So if you want to ask a question, if you could put your hand up, and then we'll invite you to speak in order, hopefully. And also, if anybody, as a reminder, if anybody has the desire to remain anonymous, you can write a question in the chat, and we will endeavour to read your question out and provide anonymity for you. So, does anybody have a question? If anybody would like to put their hand up, if not, I think we're getting a few through in the chat. Well, I'll start. Oh no, Tim has put his hand up. Tim, feel free to unmute yourself. You can fire away.
Okay, hopefully it's not too loud here. Thanks, Sam. That was really interesting, and always good to hear what you're up to these days. And this is, I guess, I'm opening the question that we've been going back and forth on for a few years, and that, especially in the context of this talk, where you're articulating a minority position within open access. And I'm always interested why we continue to use open access as the primary term for what something like the Radical Open Access Collective is aiming for. Because to me, it doesn't seem like open access, we continue to load political hopes onto it, but it seems like it's the wrong object. And so I guess the question, and again, we've been talking about this a long time, the question is whether it's useful to keep that as the main term of what we're talking about, or whether might be useful at this point to say, no, we're not after open access, because it's just a process, and we can see how it's been appropriated in all sorts of ways, and used in all sorts of ways. So I guess I just want to know what other terms can we use to talk about the kind of publishing projects we're after, which are slightly different than just open access.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's a great question. I mean, I guess I go back and forth on this a lot, because the thing I've tried to present today is that open access is useful because it allows us to kind of steal stuff and get in and take stuff, as you hopefully know by now. But you're right. I mean, it doesn't define politics. It doesn't define very much. The problem is that the moment you move away from it, you're then minoritized again, and you don't have the luxury of, like, I'm speaking to a bunch of people right now because I'm interested in open access. I wouldn't be if it was like something completely more radical, I guess. That's my sense. But I mean, people have tried to explore things like the commons and those sorts of things, and I think that there's definitely a connection and an interplay there. But it's ultimately, it probably has to take out some sort of evolution of its own and arrive. Yeah, it's a really difficult question, but I think, but there's also an important issue is like, why publishing? Like, why am I thinking about publishing from this kind of perspective? Because, like, why start there? Why not start with anything? And I think that because, like, I'm just interested in sort of publishing because, or I'm interested in the politics of publishing because I'm interested in publishing, and I probably would be if I was a bus driver or whatever. And so that's kind of more important to me, is to find the people who aren't interested in open access publishing, who are thinking about their things politically from a different perspective, and then join up and have all these interlinks in the way that I tried to kind of get across with that radical open access, the scaling small kind of idea. So yeah, I mean, at some point, open access probably will be left behind as helpful or useful. That was actually the conclusion for my PhD, and that was, what, 2 or 3 years ago now. So maybe it's already happening, and I don't know. But it's, yeah, I'd be interested if anyone has a great way of reframing it in a more political way.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, one of the things, just to jump in as there's no hands up, one of the things that I'm sort of constantly aware of is the uncertainty of what the term published means, particularly in relation to open access, with things like green, gold, diamond, preprints. As in bringing things into the public, there's a lot of different stages and phases and opportunities there, and the way that we conceive of publishing doesn't seem to reflect the diversity of opportunity that people currently engage with, let alone the politics of what could be discovered if we actually provided better terminology, whether that's open access or whether that's publishing at all. You know, are these even appropriate terms?
Yeah, and I think that that's part of the problem with the kind of the policy landscape, which I didn't talk about at all, but I could have done, because it forces us away from thinking about all these really interesting issues, and it forces particularly libraries into kind of coming up with these sort of huge infrastructures for compliance, and then we don't get to think about the more exciting side of open access. And so yeah, there's kind of another sort of strand to it, which I probably should have discussed, that does kind of think about kind of how we get away from compliance and how we can then encourage the sort of the exciting stuff, and thinking about publishing in this kind of either processual way or just like a different way, all of which being underpinned by this openness. But openness isn't really the defining thing. It's just the sort of, that's the way we do it because we can, because it's subsidized, and so therefore we don't have to make a return. And that's sort of how I think about open access. But I completely understand that kind of our library colleagues here have to deal with it, particularly in the UK, have to deal with quite a different face of it, and they have to understand about policy requirements and compliance. And a lot of researchers come to me that they're pissed off with open access because they don't want to have to engage with all these silly hoops and things. And so yeah, that's just like another side to it, I think, that's quite interesting.
Yes, again, please, if anybody does have any questions, feel free to put your hands up or write some questions in the chat, and we can pick them up. But I could speak for a good amount of time on this and ask some interesting questions. I think working operationally within the UK, supporting scholarly communications on behalf of universities, as I have done for multiple universities over the last 6 or 7 years, radical open access, or even a politics of open access that isn't of the market, is very difficult to introduce into institutional discourse. Well, that's at least been my experience. And I'm not entirely sure, well, I understand why that's the case, but it seems that, again, that term associating with open access, does that limit the possibility for radical open access within institutions?
Yeah, it's very hard. I completely understand why libraries have to think about their bottom line, and their bottom line often is, if we can get it for free, then actually supporting it financially is quite difficult for us to do. That's a policy, and you can completely understand that. So when you have I don't know, organizations like Open Library of Humanities or other sort of consortial agreements, you're saying that we're going to make this stuff open access, we just require a minimum amount of you to sort of help do that. That's quite a hard sell. Certainly, I mean, you see left, right, and centre budgets are being cut and everything, and so how can you insert that sort of radical side of things, kind of into something that we know that researchers need a specific or expect a specific service, and they probably don't expect a specific radical open access service, and so that's the sort of, I guess that again is another bind. So as much as we're sneaking in some respects, also in other respects, we're kind of locking ourselves out of more radical approaches.
Thank you. We have a question from Brianne. Feel free to unmute yourself, Brianne.
Oh, it's not a question, it's an answer. Sam asked the question. It's not an answer at all, but when I hear you talk about the politics behind your project, I think a lot about like the 90s rhizomatic politics, right? There was this idea, Deleuze and Guattari talked about it, that horizontal, really small things could spread like grass, like rhizome plants, and could in that way undertake things. But expanding that metaphor, I live in the prairies, the Canadian prairies. Rhizomes are the dominant prairie plant here, but they've been completely overtaken by European cultivars that aren't rhizomes, but are larger and bigger and suck up all of the resources. And so the grasses don't quite have the ability to undermine those trees or those invasive species. And like, to me, there's a politics metaphor there too, right? Is if the emancipation is only for those little nodes, those sort of horizontal under the ground things, is it ever enough emancipation? Is it ever getting far enough? And I'm just rephrasing your question, I think, in a way here, but it's sort of that anarchist politics versus some of the more dual power, or those struggling for the actual power in the system questions that I think we just almost always overlook in a way. I don't know.
Yeah.
That was just sort of a prompt, I guess, not an answer and not a question.
That's really lovely. That's really well put, though, I think. And I completely, I mean, I agree that at some point bigness does have to take over. We can't just be small the whole time, and we can't just be in retreat. And that's a criticism of Mohsen and Hani in many ways, is that they are wanting to exist in this institution, and they're not talking about going out and building something bigger. And it's still in many ways grounded on things like property and such. Like the idea of the commons, the undercommons, is still sort of grounded on this idea of property. And so at some point, these big ideas that abolish things like property and abolish kind of ideas of individuation and that kind of stuff, they have to take over. I just don't even know how to kind of begin with that kind of certainly when we have these discussions, and then I step back, I think, but we're talking about open access publishing. Like there's this just weird interplay that the moment you start talking about the politics of it and you go so far back and you realize that open access just can't do that. And so it has to always be small, and everything has to be small. But I don't know. That's a really nice metaphor though.
Thank you very much. There is a question that's come through, so I will ask it. Do you think there is any hope to steer the whole OA landscape away from APCs and gold open access, or have we already let commercial publishers seize that market? Is it too late?
I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this. I mean, it's probably way too late. I mean, if you think about like conceptions of the university, they kind of want this sort of stuff, don't they? The university wants APCs and things. It's very hard to get away from all of it, and so that's why I ask about if the university has to sort of be upended in order to kind of reach something more radical. Like, of course it does. I mean, obviously, a landscape where all research is published in a diamond open access journal by more ethical outfits than Elsevier, and it's done in a kind of commercial way that's still better than what we've got, and I'd be happy enough with that. But it's just, but yeah, I mean, the battle against these 5 big publishers is lost. It was lost years ago, and I don't know if that's something which we can ever hope to kind of get back. But I think that sort of slips into the idea of transition talk and the bigness talk, which I kind of want to get away from, even though it's so tempting to. And that's so, yeah, I mean, that's a kind of a roundabout way of answering the question. So.
Thank you very much for the answer, and thank you very much for the question as well. I see that there is a hand up, so if Stuart would like to unmute and fire away.
Hi, yeah, I was just going to echo what you basically just said, as in agreeing that I think it is too late. The big struggle going on right now in the UK library community is to try and force Elsevier to start having a transformative agreement. That is what we're fighting for as a collective. So yeah, we are not going to get out of that kind of relationship if that's the approach that we're collectively struggling for.
Yeah.
Which absolutely, as you're aware, it's from working within the library community, the open access workers within libraries are the people. That is where a great deal of the labour to make open access happen is based. Most people that have a job specifically about open access work in university libraries. At least in the UK, that's certainly the case. And all of us are just running to keep up with meeting policy requirements, and that's all we can do. And I mean, speaking personally, I've stopped really fighting at all within my institution for anything more interesting to happen, partly because I don't see it as a possibility, and partly because my institution does not, I don't see it as a big institution. I don't see that it cares for its employees in a way that I think there's any kind of reasonable relationship between what am I trying to get at? Basically, my employer doesn't care about me, so why should I fight for my employer to try and do things in a different way when I just don't see any hope for that? Mm-hmm. So yeah. That's not very hopeful kind of message, is it? But there we go.
Well, I completely agree with it though, but and that's why a lot of this comes back to kind of essentially a volunteerist kind of doing this in our spare time as a labor of love, because it's not, I mean, it can be valued I think you can take resources from some areas of higher education, but still ultimately it's up to us in our spare time to do most of this stuff, and that's not great, and that's not how it should be. And so yeah, I completely see the sort of the somewhat absurd, the absurd nature of negotiating with Elsevier for them to sign a transformative agreement. It's ridiculous. And I think potentially there's a UK issue as well here, that we've gone so hard into this kind of weird policy landscape of gold open access and the block grants and kind of, and it's just this kind of weird web of so many things you need to keep up with and such. I'd imagine other countries have it too and have it in a sort of different kind of respect, but we're quite strange, I think. So
yes.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions that have come in, so I'll read the first one. As editor of a very small academic journal that is also a member of the Radical Open Access Collective, the Journal of Northern Renaissance, my sense is that we're seeing the emergence of a whole academic underclass who aren't going to play the game anymore and are much more interested in publishing work in innovative forms, in playing with the genre of the academic article in politicized ways. Journals like ours can be more open to. What do you think the implications of the adjunctification and worse of the humanities might be for open access?
I mean, sorry, who was that? Was that Patrick's question?
It's in the comments, and I'm trying to read those anonymously. But
okay, sorry. Yeah, well, it's a good question. And I think they have spun quite a positive spin on adjunctification there by saying that it does allow us to publish in these exciting and interesting ways. And I think, I mean, I do like the idea of diverting one's labour. Hi, Patrick, and diverting one's labour and doing it in this kind of way that recognises that actually so much of the current kind of publishing industry is propped up by free or unremunerated labour by the publishers. And so if you can kind of then take that over and move it to something more interesting, exciting, etc., like that's the way to do it. But of course, the bind there is that it's not being remunerated because we're precarious and we don't have careers, and so I think, I mean, ultimately the precarity of higher education for the humanities is terrible for all reasons, as I'm sure you know. I mean, the thing is, I mean, I'm now not in a traditional academic position. I get to do these kinds of stuff because I have a bit more security than I did, and so to that extent, maybe that's the kind of good thing that people can move into more secure positions. But yeah, sorry, again, just going roundabout on this answer because I don't have a good answer, but I think it's wonderful where people are kind of experimenting with form and with content and doing it in a way, again, that doesn't have this sort of commercial return associated with it. That's the goal. The goal isn't open access. It's to do these things predicated on openness, have them subsidized, and doing it from that. And you can already see things like that's where I talk about the new university press landscape, because they're very similar to what I'm arguing for. You have things like the White Rose Press or UCL Press, various other new university presses, where universities have said, like, yes, we're doing this for our brand, but we want to give you some money to publish, and we want to do it kind of this way, and we're going to kind of hire a publishing manager, and they're going to have a bit of freedom to do what they want. That's kind of a positive development, I think, and that sort of speaks to that kind of idea that there's money being freed up in different places. So yeah, another roundabout answer, but a good question.
I think big topic, so I think you handled the question very well. And another question that's come in, what about the green route to open access? Do you still think it's relevant / effective?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a paper I think it's the start of this year it was published, and it argues for kind of strategic engagement with funder policies that specifically require, like Plan S, that specifically require zero embargo, green open access. That was what they were talking about at some stage, and then they went down this kind of rights retention kind of plan, and it kind of messed everything up, or at least it messed my article up. But yes, I mean, that is another, if we're thinking about in terms of smallness and strategic and sort of tactical engagement with the publishing industry, that is, like, green open access is quite good, and being able to sort of force their hand, and that's where the policy landscape should be going. It should be kind of fighting tooth and nail for green open access, and not unless so the kind of rights retention strategy, which just puts everything on the individual author rather than allows anyone to sort of to publish it, green open access immediately. So actually I do see a really important role for Green OA, simply for sort of tempering the excesses of kind of gold commercial publishing.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Sorry, I was just trying to read what came up, but I missed it.
I think we're getting quite a few comments in the chat, which are wonderful to see the conversation emerging in various ways simultaneously, which makes it very difficult to try and chair the session. But thank you very much for all the comments down there. If anybody has any final questions, I suppose now would be the time to fire them in. It's been great to have a vibrant session here. I'm certainly very grateful for it. I'll just remind everybody that we are running sessions every day this week, so you can go on and book your positions. There's plenty of space available, they're uncapped. So if anybody wants to carry on with some of these conversations, we will be, as I say, having sessions every day. And then on Friday, we are having a chat about how we might take things forward from the things that we've discussed and learnt this week. Okay, there's no more questions coming in and nobody has their hand up. So at this point, I'm going to thank you very much, Sam, for delivering this keynote today, and the Q&A session has been very exciting. So thank you very much, and I'd like to thank all of the attendees for coming and making the session as vibrant as it has been. And we shall all carry these on throughout the week, I hope. So on that note, thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone. It was very enjoyable. I'm going to read the comments now.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.